Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. It looks like everyone who's signed up to be here is here, so we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think everyone here is a repeat customer, so I'm not going to go through my whole spiel about who I am. We can go ahead and dive in. One quick thing though, since all of you are in the audio broadcast, please use the Q&A box right in the WebEx to ask any questions you might have. We will hold all questions till the end, but please feel free to enter your questions as they pop into your mind. And with that, I'm going to hand you right off to Dick. So take it away, Dick.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, let me position my my slides, and we'll get started. All right, so we've been talking about recovery activities, maintenance activities of a DBA, and we finished last week by talking about the rollback utility. And if you remember the rollback utility, what we were doing there was taking the database, typically as it exists at the moment, and taking journal files that preceded this point in time and rolling backwards through before images to take the database back to some point in the past. Today what we're going to do is start out looking at the roll forward utility, and this is more or less the opposite, where we're going to be starting at some point in the past, usually determined by some type of recovery or restoration of a backup file, and then bringing the database up to some point in time after the creation of that backup. So the roll forward utility, as we look at our utility diagrams that we've been using, roll forward is a recovery statement or a utility statement. It runs under the control of IDMS BCF. Input parameters come in through DD statement sysipt, and an output listing goes through sys or comes out through syslist. The input into roll forward is a set of journal files, basically concatenated archive files for the time period covering the recovery. And of course, the output is a database that has its integrity restored. Optionally, we can have some sort work files defined to roll forward, which are going to be necessary if we're going to be using the sort option for the utility, or the recovery utility, and we'll be talking about that. And why am I not advancing? Interesting. Okay. We may have to we may have to do the brute force method. Okay, so the roll forward utility, as I mentioned, starts with the former state of the database. So you're at the present point in time, you realize that there's something wrong. It might be that the database has had invalid work run through it, maybe a batch job with the wrong input data. You might have some type of media error, some type of an I/O error has developed, or some type of physical structure on the disk drive has gone bad, so you've got to go back to some point in time. So we're going to be going to a backup file, and then starting at that point, we're going to be taking the after images that IDMS generated, all of the results of the update operations, and rolling them forward through the database to create a database at some point in time where our integrity is restored. So again, it uses the after images to progressively restore the file segment or area to the point that we want to deal with it. The journal, the input for the roll forward is the journal file, and that is a sequential file that can reside on disk or tape. Now, it's going to depend on how you want to run your roll forward as to whether it's going to be on disk or tape. If you specify the sequential option, the journal file must reside on tape, because what happens here is that we start reading the file in a forward direction. And at some point in time, we're going to come through, we're going to find a begin checkpoint for a run unit. We're going to start applying the after images, and then possibly we may come across an abort checkpoint for that particular run unit. So it's very possible that during the execution of a particular program, that program blew up. IDMS detected that error condition, writes an abort image, and then rolls back that run unit. So by running the roll forward, what we've just done is applied images for a run unit that aborted and who had already been rolled off of the database. So we don't want those images there. So what the sequential option will do is when it finds that abort checkpoint, it changes direction and starts reading the file in a backwards direction, reapplying all of the before images for that particular run unit. It then moves forward, repositions itself to that abort checkpoint, and then starts processing forward. So again, because you can't read off of a disk file in a backwards manner, that sequential option is going to require that the journal files be on a tape so that we can physically reverse the direction of read. Now, one of the other things with sequential is that it, in essence, is putting all of the records back on the database in the same manner in which they were created. So if you updated a particular record 10 times through a course of this recovery period, IDMS is, every time it encounters one of those after images, it's going to go back to that page and it's going to restore that after image. So when you're doing a roll forward, if you're covering a day's worth of journals for that roll forward, it can take many hours to actually do the roll forward because it's bouncing all over the database, updating records as it encounters the after images. So in the same way where we wanted to speed that up, we can use the sorted option. And sorted option we can use either a disk or a tape file, because what sorted will do is go through and read the input file, selecting those records that it feels are going to be necessary for the recovery process. It then sorts everything down. Anytime it finds an aborted run unit, it gets rid of those aborted records through the sorting process, and then only applies the last after image for the particular record. So if that record, as the example I used, had been updated 10 times through the course of the recovery period, the only after image that we're going to apply is the last after image. So not only do I have the ability to run roll forward from a disk file by using sorted, I also can significantly reduce the amount of time that the recovery is going to require, because I'm not bouncing all over the database for each individual record. I'm only going to apply that one after image. And also, as a result of the sort, we kind of end up doing the database as if it were an area sweep, because we sort these things down by DB key as well. So it just makes one pass through the database applying those after images. So running sorted is faster, and it allows you to use either disk or tape for your input journal files. Now, if you have multiple journal files, they have got to be consolidated into a single file. So before you roll forward, take the journal files that are going to be involved with the process and run them through an IBGener, concatenating them into a single file, and you put them in the order that they were created as input into the IBGener or some other type of similar utility. My apologies, this is just not going to advance for me. So, as we go forward with roll forward, a Quiesce point, you're going to want to do the recovery from some type of a Quiesce point. And a Quiesce point is a point in time in which there is no update activity for some portion of a database. So if somebody comes through and says, they ran the wrong data at midnight. Well, what you want to do is go back to some point before midnight and or go to your I'm sorry, go back to your backup file and then roll forward to that quiesce point just before midnight, because that is going to be the point in time the last point in time prior to the bad data going on to the database. So again, you're going to want to use that print journal utility to go through there and look at your checkpoints for the various areas that are being involved to identify that particular point in time to which you're going to do the roll forward. So you're going to want to begin that recovery at the at a quiesce point. Now, before we get into the hot backups, typically you're going to be going back to a backup, and that backup becomes a quiesce point. So you want to find the point in your journals that corresponds with that backup file. So you start the recovery from that quiescence point, and you roll forward to the point, the quiesce point after or at the point where the database would be restored to its integrity. Now, we've been talking about this type of process all along, but after you're done, you want to check the validity of that database. So that is going to encompass running maybe IDMS DBAN, not so much print spaces, because you're not necessarily not going to know the true numbers of records on the database after the updating processing, but the DBAN is at least going to go through and tell you if there's any broken chains or any types of exception conditions that exist on the database. You also probably want to go through and run some type of application processes. Maybe you've got some report processes. Go out there, run, make sure that they're good. Have your users look at the numbers and say, yep, these numbers make sense, whatever it is. You could maybe do some OLQ or culprit work against that. But the main thing that we're looking at here is to point out that you want to verify the recovery operation has been correctly executed. So the next thing we want to move on to is hot backup. What we've been talking about so far is coming through with a standard backup procedure. At some point in time, you vary a set of areas offline, or you varied them to retrieval, and then you took a copy of the database. So that copy of the database had its integrity ensured. I mean, you should have, if you didn't have any broken chains in the database, you should have no broken chains. The logical integrity of the database should be in place. So you can take that backup and you can just restore that backup knowing that you've got a good database. You may have to do roll forward operations or roll back operations from that point in time, but at least you know that the backup was good and was clean. Okay. Well, there is a procedure that can be implemented called hot backup. And as sites have evolved into 24/7 applications, it's getting harder and harder for sites to be able to come through and find the time to either bring down a database or even to take it off of the online updating or any type of updating processing so that you can take that backup. So what has been used for many years, probably a couple decades really, I know we started talking about this type of thing back in the 80s, is coming up with this hot backup procedure, which allows you to update the database while you're taking the backup of the appropriate areas. Okay, so some things, as we point out, that you have to consider if you're going to go to a hot backup strategy. The first one, the time to recover using a hot backup may be longer than backup produced while the area was quiesced due to additional steps in the recovery process. remember that when that backup finishes, that backup file is not going to be a good backup from the standpoint of just putting it back onto the database and running. You're going to have broken chains on that. You're probably going to have logical integrity issues. But all we're doing with this hot backup is creating a start point that is then going to allow you to use the journals to recover that integrity. But as a result, you're going to have to do some additional steps in there. So the recovery operation may take a bit longer. Even because it's taking longer, we're accepting that overhead for the fact that I can get my database backed up and never have to go offline. So I can maintain that 24/7 environment and still have the necessary backups to recover the database if the need arises. Okay, so the second subpoint here, to recover using a file produced during a hot backup, all archived journal files created while the backup was taking place must also be available. Those are the journal files that are going to be needed to at least get the backup into a place where the contents of the database are good. You may need subsequent other journal files to bring it up to some other point in time or back to some other point in time, but you're going to need all of those archive files that were generated by your CV during the backup so that you can do this extra step. And then to ensure the availability of the archived journal files, you should treat them in the same way as the backup files. And what I'm insinuating there is that you make sure that they're saved. I mean, most sites are going to have some type of procedure where they're going to probably take some backup files and they're going to put them off-site. In case they have some type of major disaster. When you want to deal with your archive files, and especially those archive files created during the backup process in the same manner, the copies of those should be going off-site, just like any other type of recovery medium. So the first thing we want to talk about is the procedure for creating the hot backup. So again, the whole point here is that we're going to allow the updates while this backup is occurring. Now, it is still necessary at some point in time to generate a quiesce point. In other words, a point where you know that there's no activity on the database. But when I was bringing the database offline to do the backup, that quiesce point or that period of time was very long. What we're going to be doing with the hot backup is doing a very short or relatively short outage type procedure. So you could quiesce the database. You could do it with DCMT vary the areas offline. You could do a DCMT quiesce command, and where you hold that quiesce point for a short moment in time. But you do create this moment in time where we know no updates are going on against the database. So when I create that quiesce point, I want to record the date and time that the areas were quiesced. So if I have to do a recovery, I can say, okay, it was 12:07 and 30 seconds yesterday morning when we started our hot backup, when we created our quiesce point. So you must remember or in some way be able to identify the date and time that those areas were quiesced. While the database is quiesced, you want to force a new archive journal file to be created. So while the databases are in that short period of time where they're offline, you're going to want to do a DCMT vary journal so that you get a clean cutoff of the journals before the backup started and anything after the journals. Once you do that DCMT vary journal command, you can then restart the update activity against the target areas. So you can vary them back online. You could release a quiesce through the DCMT quiesce commands and start all your processing. Once you started your update processing, you can now start the backup. So you copy all of the files containing the areas that are going to be affected or going to be included within this hot backup. So this is running while you're doing the updating. When the backup file or the backup of the files completes, then you can optionally establish a second Quiesce point for those target areas. In other words, you would do the same type of thing that you were doing in steps 1 and 2. Quiesce the areas, vary them offline. During that point in time, vary the journal, and then you could release the areas and continue on with your processing. And we're going to see as we look at the recovery actions how that optional Quiesce point may change some of the steps that you would take. So this is a decision that you're going to make in terms of how you want to implement the hot backup. And it really, I mean, there's no major differences. It's just, how you prefer to establish that environment. Okay, so then after you would establish the second point, you mark the backup process by forcing a new archived journal file to be created, and you're going to want to do that even if you don't do that optional Quiesce point. You're still going to want to force the journal files. And then if a second Quiesce point was established, at this point in time, you would restart the update activity within the target areas. So once I've got this environment or this hot backup environment created, now how do we actually use this hot backup to restore the integrity of our database? So you're going to have two procedures for performing a hot backup or recovery, and which procedure you use is in a way going to be determined by whether or not you took that optional second Quiesce point after the backup completed. Now, the first one we're going to look at, procedure 1 can always be used to recover from a backup, provided that, of course, and we always say this, that the correct procedures were followed when the backup was taken, and that the necessary journal and backup files are all available. So procedure 1 can always be used. Procedure 2 is a procedure that you can use if you established the two quiescence points during the hot backup. In other words, once that backup completed, you quiesced the database and then restarted everything so you had that extra spot. Now, the backward read, the main thing here is that we're going to have to be doing some roll forward processing within that structure, and it is going to require the backup recovery. So, or the possibility that we're going to have to read the files backwards. So, if backup read is supported for your input journal files, in other words, you put them on tape, you could use this procedure too. Should we point out this last bullet here that backward read is not available in some VM environments, or if the journals can only reside on disk. So take that into consideration. So procedure 1, we've had some type of failure that requires recovery. So the first thing is to take the files that were created during the hot backup and copy them back into the database. So once that recovery is done, remember I'm still probably going to have broken chains on that database. There's going to be logical integrity problems on it because there were updates going on while that backup was being taken. So while that file is actually, or those backup files are being restored, what you're going to want to do is go through an investigation process. And so you're going to want to identify first the Quiesce point that was taken at the beginning of the backup procedure. In other words, the point that started this whole hot backup. The archived journal files created since that quiescence point was generated, and the journal file created at the end of the backup procedure. So we're going to kind of give the journal files created during the creation of the hot backup a special kind of status here. We're going to want to process them individually. And then you're going to want to know all of the journal files created since the Quiesce point up to the point of the failure. So let's say that it was, again, this bad data, and the bad data was run a couple hours after the hot backup created. Though what we're talking about here in point C would be the journal files from the beginning of the hot backup all the way through the point of failure where that bad data was actually being created. So once I've identified all of these pieces, the next thing is to consolidate in the sequence in which they were created the archive journal files created between the Quiesce point and the end of the backup procedure. Okay, so these are the journals that we're going to use to just make the hot backup copy good. Okay, so we're going to consolidate them individually. Once I've got those archives consolidated into a single journal file, you're going to want to determine whether or not, can I support read backwards? In other words, are they on tape? Or if they're on disk, if they're the read back, they're on disk and they're not supported, then you're going to want to do the pre-sort of those journal records between the Quiesce point and the end of the backup. If you remember, we talked about this when we talked about the rollback utility, and you would sort them with the parameters that we specified with the rollback, and you would then use the rollback 3490 parameter in your sys-IDMS procedures. So if you're on disk and you're not going to be able to support the rollback, the read backwards, you're going to want to pre-sort those journal records within that reverse sequence. So now what we want to do is remove all of the problems that backup file has. So you go through and you run the rollback utility from from those archive files that were created during the hot backup procedure. So that backup, we consider that to be restored at the end of the backup procedure. We're now going to roll backwards to the beginning of the rollback procedure, that quiescence point that was established at the very start of the backup procedure. So once we finish that rollback, that database should be a good database. It should be an image of that database as it appeared when you did the Quiesce point at the beginning of the hot backup procedure. But that might not be the point to which you need the database recovered. So we go to step 6 and consolidate in the sequence in which they were created all of the archive journal files created since the Quiesce point established at the start of the backup procedure. So again, if the problem was that, again, we had this bad data a couple hours later, I now concatenate or consolidate all of my journal files from the Quiesce point of the hot backup through the Quiesce point to which I want to do a roll forward to get to the actual point before the failure. And then you're going to use the roll forward utility to roll forward the updates from the Quiesce point to the point of failure. So you can see that part of this hot backup, we had that extra step where we had to recover the backup to just allow the backup to resemble a good database by doing that first rollback. And then we could do the roll forward up to our point of failure. Now, procedure 2 is something that I'm going to be able to use if I have the ability to, or if I've used those 2 Quiesce points. So once again, copy the files that need to be recovered from the backup. Now I want to identify the 2 Quiesce points that were taken during the backup process, the one before the backup started and the one that was generated after the completion of the backup. I also want to identify the archive journal files that were created between those Quiesce points and then also after the second Quiesce point. So these first 2 steps pretty much the same as the first 2 steps of procedure number 1. Number 3, consolidate in the sequence in which they were created the archived journal files created between the two quiescence points established using the backup procedure. So again, these are just the journal files prior or created during the creation of the backup file. Now I'll use the roll forward utility to do a roll forward against that portion of the database. In other words, I'm now going to take the database that still has some problems in it because of the hot backup condition, and then I'm going to roll forward to the next quiescence point. Once that quiescence point is finished, I now have a good database. In other words, there should be no broken pointers, and the contents of the database should be something that your applications would be able to use. That, of course, may not be the point at which the point of failure was involved. So we can consolidate in the sequence that they were created, the archived journal files created after the second quiescence point, and established, and I can then roll forward using that information or those images of the database to recover moving forward to the point of failure. You could also, at some point in time, then, if you had to go backwards in time because it was shorter to maybe do a roll backwards, you could then use journal files that preceded the hot backup file in conjunction with those things to roll backwards. So you can see here that if what I actually want to do is roll forward all the way through there, I'm basically doing 2 roll forwards within that structure. So again, this is a procedure that sites have used for many years now. But we are seeing more and more sites looking at going into the hot backup because their applications are just getting to the point where they can't afford to have the database with any downtime. Now, the description of the hot backup also is defined in a number of different places. And really, I guess I should not just say that this is the hot backup, but you can find the hot backup description in the database administration guide. And of course, the utilities guide has the information about the individual utilities that you'll be using. But this is also a good piece of reference to go back for all of the things that we've been talking about within the scope of the last 6-7 weeks within this material. Database administration guide talks a lot about the the relationships of different activities and different components within IDMS. And of course, the utilities guide is going to give you the information that you need to do the full execution of any of the utilities that we've talked about. So that basically has brought us to the completion of this material. So just a real quick summarization of the things that we've looked at through these 7 weeks. The first thing we did was look at the need and evaluate the need for some of the various maintenance activities. And then we looked, once you've done that, we talked about those types of activities that are going to be on a reoccurring basis. They might be to need to maybe expand the database or just to do an unload reload just to reorganize it in a more efficient manner. Might be maintain index to rebuild index, cleanup to clean up logically deleted records, things of that nature. And then we specifically looked at enlarging the database using either unload reload, reorg, again, possibly maintain index if all we need to do is expand an index area. And then we talked about the modification of the database. Those things where we're actually going to change the structures of records and the types of sets and things of that nature. And then finally, the recovery of the database. So these are all the things that as a DBA, you're probably at some point in time in your career are going to be called upon to implement and execute. So at that point, I'm going to open it up for any questions. Certainly we can deal with anything specifically on recovery, or if there is something on any of the other material that somebody maybe wants to go back and has a question on, we can certainly entertain that. Len?
All right, great, Dick. Thanks as always. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now, but folks, now is the time. So if you have any questions for Dick, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. We'll give you a minute to do that. As always, this webcast replay will be available out in the community either later today or on Monday. And this is also the end of the line. So this is our 7th of 7 IDMS educational webcasts. So we do some more IDMS webcasts in the works, but they will not be part of this series. And I don't see any questions coming in, so maybe we can go ahead and wrap. If any questions come up later, please feel free to ask them out in the community, and we'll make sure that Dick sees them. So Dick, thank you very much. Oh, hold on. One just came in. I used many times application backups in case of restored required to point in recovery. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment. All right, I don't see anything else coming in, so I think we can go ahead and wrap. Dick, thank you very much. And for those of you who have given your time this morning, once again, thank you as well, and we'll see you out in the community, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.